Hello and welcome to this class on third conditional. I am the teacher, Gonzalo Rocha, and let's start. We're going to start with the function. First, it says, we use the third conditional to talk about hypothetical situations in the past. That means that these situations did not happen. These are unreal situations. It says these situations are the result of other actions. We're always going to have two actions. One action is going to be the result of the other action. Let's see some examples. It says, if I had studied, I might have passed the exam. So these two situations are hypothetical. They didn't happen. It didn't happen. He didn't study and he didn't pass the exam. And one is the result of the other. I might have passed the exam if I had studied. So this is the condition. And if this condition is met, if this is true, if he had studied, he would have passed the exam. When you study, you pass the exam. So this is the result of this other action. Now let's see the next one. I wouldn't have met my favorite singer if I hadn't come to the concert. So these two are, again, hypothetical situations. These are unreal. These didn't actually happen. But because we have a negative, wouldn't and hadn't, that means that these situations did happen. He's hypothetically imagining what if the opposite was true. So he did meet his favorite singer and he did come to the concert. So this is talking about if I hadn't come to the concert, the result was that he wouldn't have met his favorite singer. So one is the result of the other. Let's continue. Okay, now we're going to talk about the form. The third conditional always has two clauses. Remember that when we talk about clauses, we talk about sentences where we have one subject and one verb. We are talking about one action. Each clause talks about an action and it needs to have one subject and one verb. So we use two clauses. We use the conditional clause and the result clause. So we have an example here. The conditional clause is if Charlie had woken up early. That is the conditional clause. We have a subject, which is Charlie, and we have a verb, had woken up. So that is one clause. We're talking about one action, one situation. And we also have the result clause. It says, he could have been more productive. Again, we have one whole action, one whole situation, and we have a subject, which is he, and a verb, could have been more productive. Again, this is another situation, and this result clause is the result situation of the conditional. Remember, we always have one result from the other. And here below, we have some notes about each clause. The first one, it says the conditional clause always starts with the word if. So whenever you see the word if, that means that the clause that is after the if, it's going to be always the conditional clause. That is how we're going to identify the conditional clause when we started with the word if. And the other note says the result clause doesn't include the word if. So we're only going to include the word if in one of the two clauses. So in the second one, we don't have the word if. We just have he could have been more productive. Let's continue with the form. It says each clause uses a different tense. So depending if we are talking about the if clause or the result clause, they're going to use different grammar. We use the past perfect in the conditional clause. So whenever we have if, we're going to use the past perfect. For example, again, if Charlie had woken up early. So this sentence is using the past perfect. We start the sentence with if because it's the conditional clause. We have the subject, Charlie. We have literally the word had because this is the past perfect tense. We use had with the past perfect tense. And we also have the past participle. Remember that? We use the had and the past participle when we're talking about the past perfect. The next one, we use the would, could, or might, and the present perfect in the result clause. So again, we have the result clause. We don't start it with if because it's the result clause. It says he could have been more productive. So we're going to start this conditional clause with a subject, he. And then we're going to use either one of these three words, could, or would, or might. So in this case, we're using could. Subject he could, the word could, and then we're going to use literally the word have because we are talking in the present perfect. And we're going to add the past participle of the action verb to the have. So remember, the conditional clause uses the past perfect, and the result clause where it's going to use would, could, or might, and the present perfect. The comma. This is a very important part of the third conditional. On the third conditional, we are sometimes going to use a comma. And right now, let's learn about when do we use it. It says, sometimes we use a comma to separate the conditional clause from the result clause. When the if clause is at the beginning of the sentence, we separate the two clauses using a comma. So let's see the example. It says, if I hadn't studied philosophy, that is the conditional clause, then we have a comma. I wouldn't have met Jessica. That is the result clause. So we have a comma in the middle that is separating each clause. Before the comma, we have the conditional clause, and after the comma, we have the result clause. That is going to help us identify where is the conditional clause and what is the result clause. Let's talk more about the comma. So what happens if we don't use a comma? Here we have an example. If I hadn't studied philosophy, I wouldn't have met Jessica. So in this sentence, it is a little bit confusing. Where is the conditional clause? Where does the conditional clause ends and where does the other one starts? That is why it's important to use a comma to separate the two clauses. Okay, but we also use the if word to separate the clauses. It says, on the other hand, we can use the if from the conditional clause to separate the two clauses. Remember that the word if, it's always going to be in front of the conditional clause. Always. The if is not going to separate itself from the conditional clause. We're not going to move it. Whenever we have if, that is going to be the start of the conditional clause. So let's see an example. First, in this case, we have the result clause at the beginning. It says, I wouldn't have met Jessica. That is the result clause, and we have it at the beginning. And then we have the conditional clause, if I hadn't studied philosophy. Because this conditional clause starts with if, we don't need the comma. Because the if, it's already separating the two clauses. Okay, and that's it for the presentation. So let's see some examples. Let's do some practice so that you can understand this a little bit better. Okay, now let's do some practice on the third conditional. Here we have a little reminder for each of the clauses. What tense are we going to use? Remember, for the conditional clause, we're going to use the past perfect, which is had, and the past participle of the verb. For the result clause, we're going to use either would or could or might. We're going to decide on which of these we're going to use. And we're going to add also the present perfect, which is have plus the past participle of the verb. Let's start with number one. It starts with the if word. So this means that it's going to start with the conditional clause at the beginning. So because the conditional clause uses the past perfect, we're going to use these information to complete the sentence in the past perfect. So we need literally the word had, and the past participle of be. Oh, sorry. Because it says not, we're talking about a negative sentence. So we're going to put hadn't. And now we're going to use the past participle of the verb be, which is been. If you hadn't been late. And now here we have a comma to separate the conditional clause with the result clause. So we're going to complete this. It says we not miss the bus. So remember that the result clause, we use would, could, or might. So we're going to start with the word would. We would, and because we're talking about not, we're going to add wouldn't. Not miss. Now we're going to use the present perfect with the word miss. Okay, now let's do that result clause. In here, we're going to start with either would, could, or might. Let's start with would. Would. But because it says not, we're going to use the negative form of would, which is wouldn't. Now, the main verb here is the word miss. So we're going to use the present perfect with the word miss. Remember, the present perfect starts with have. So let's start with have. Have, and then we're going to use the past participle of the main verb, which is miss. So I wouldn't have, because miss is a regular verb, we're going to use real simple, add ed. We wouldn't have missed the bus. And that's it for the sentence number 1. Now let's go and do sentence number 2. Here, because we don't start with the if, that means that the first clause is going to be the result clause, and we're going to use the present perfect and would, could, or might. So let's start right there. She, we're going to use would again. She would. And then the present perfect. Remember, we start the present perfect with the word have. She would have. And the main verb we're going to use is the verb pass, which needs to be in the past participle. She would have. Again, we have a regular verb, so it's going to be really simple. And we're going to use the ed at the end. She would have passed the exam if she. Here we are on the conditional clause because we start with the word if. So this next one, we're going to use the past perfect of the word study. So remember, for the past perfect, we start with had. Had. If she had. And now the past participle of study. Again, we have a regular verb, so the past participle is going to be studied. She would have passed the exam if she had studied. Pretty simple. And there we have sentence number 2. Now let's do sentence number 3. Again, here we're starting with the word if, so that means we start with the conditional clause. So, again, past perfect, we start with had, and then the main verb is arrive. The past participle of arrive, because it's a regular verb, is going to be arrived with ed. If we had arrived, and that's it for the conditional clause, now let's do the result clause. So the main verb we're going to use here is the word see. Now, we're going to start with either would, could, or might. So let's start this time with the word might. And now we're going to use the present perfect with the verb see. So remember, the present perfect starts with have and then the past participle. The past participle of see, because it's not a regular verb, now we don't have a regular verb, it's going to be seen. That is the past participle of the verb see. Okay, now let's do sentence number 4. Because there's no if at the beginning, that means we're starting with the result clause. So we're going to use either would, could, or might. So let's use the word would. And because it says not, it is indicating that we're using a negative sentence. So we're going to put wouldn't. They wouldn't, and we're going to use now the present perfect. So we're going to start with have. And the past participle of wake. He wouldn't have, because this is an irregular verb, we're going to do it woken. That is the past participle of the verb wake. So we finished that. They wouldn't have woken up late. And here, again, we have the if that is separating the two clauses. That means what comes after this is the conditional clause. So let's do the conditional clause. Okay, so remember that the conditional clause, we're going to use the past perfect. So we're going to start with the verb had. And now the past participle of go, which is gone. And there we have number 4. They wouldn't have woken up late if they had gone to bed early. Now for number 5. This is the last one. In number 5, again, we start with if. That means we're starting with the conditional clause. So we're going to do the past perfect. If he had, and then the past participle of become, which is the same, become. If he had become a musician, and now we're doing the second part, which is the result clause. Remember that we use a comma to separate these two. So we're going to start with a result clause. So we're going to use would, could, or might, and the present perfect. So we're going to start with, again, might. He might, and the present perfect, which is have, and the past participle of record. Might have, record, it's a regular verb, so that means we're only going to add ed at the end. He might have recorded a CD. So complete the sentence is, if he had become a musician, he might have recorded a CD. And that's it for this class. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you on the next class.